The winter light over eastern France had a way of making everything look unfinished. Half-built hedgerows, half-destroyed barns, half-buried men. Sergeant Daniel Mercer stood at the edge of the field with his hands jammed deep into his coat pockets, breath fogging the air, watching a column of German prisoners shuffle past under guard. Their boots were wrapped in rags. Their greatcoats hung off them like borrowed clothes. They didn't look like the monsters the newspapers had promised. They looked like men who had been hollowed out. Mercer had seen a lot since landing with the 4th Infantry Division, Normandy, hedgerows, the long grind east, but there was something about prisoners that always unsettled him. The fight was gone from them. Whatever had made them dangerous had burned itself out somewhere far behind their eyes. The prisoners stopped near a wrecked stone farmhouse that now served as a temporary holding pen. Military police waved them into a loose line. A captain from intelligence stood nearby with a clipboard, his collar turned up, jaw tight. He nodded toward Mercer. "Sergeant," the captain said, "you speak some German, right?" "Enough to get myself in trouble," Mercer answered. "Good. I need you to listen and write down exactly what they say, not what you think they mean, what they say." Mercer nodded. He'd done this before, questioning survivors, broken men pulled from foxholes. But this felt different. The captain's eyes kept drifting to one particular group, 6 German tankers, their black uniforms dulled by mud and smoke. They stood apart from the others, shoulders hunched, faces grey with something deeper than exhaustion. One of them was shaking. They were brought forward, one at a time. Names, units, serial numbers, standard procedure. Most answered in flat voices, already resigned. Then the captain gestured to the shaking tanker, a corporal, no older than 22. "Ask him about the Eastern Front," the captain said quietly. Mercer hesitated. "Sir? Just ask." Mercer stepped closer. The corporal's eyes flicked up, sharp despite the fatigue. When Mercer spoke German, the man flinched, like he'd been struck. "You were in Russia?" Mercer asked. The corporal swallowed. His lips moved before any sound came out. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "Yes. What unit?" "Panzer, near Smolensk, then farther east." Mercer nodded, pen poised. "Tell me about the first time you fought Soviet tanks." The corporal stared past Mercer, past the field, past the ruined farmhouse, like he was looking through a hole in the world. His hands were trembling now, openly. "We heard them before we saw them," he said. "A different sound, deeper, like the ground itself was moving." Mercer wrote. The captain leaned in slightly. The corporal's words came faster now, tumbling out as if he'd been waiting years to unload them. "Our guns, our 37s, they bounced. You could see it. Sparks, like throwing stones at a monster." Mercer felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He'd heard rumors, sure. New Russian tanks, sloped armor. But this wasn't rumor. This was memory. "What did you say?" Mercer asked softly. The corporal laughed once. It came out wrong. "We said, what is that? We said it shouldn't exist." Behind Mercer, one of the American guards muttered, "Jesus." The corporal kept going. They came through the fog, green, wide tracks. The shells screamed and did nothing. One of our officers, he stood up in the hatch, screaming orders, and the tank just... He made a flat chopping motion with his hand. Gone, like stepping on an insect. Mercer stopped writing. For a second, he forgot where he was. He could see it too clearly. Fog, iron shapes moving through it, men realizing too late that the rules had changed. "What did you think?" Mercer asked. The corporal looked at him then, really looked at him. "I thought the war was over," he said. "I thought God had switched sides." The captain raised a hand. That was enough. They moved. On to the next tanker. And the next. Different faces, same story. The words changed, but the meaning didn't. Our guns were useless. They didn't burn. They kept coming. One man said they thought the Soviets had stolen blueprints from the future. Another said they believed the tanks were invincible until they saw one finally die after being swarmed with explosives at point-blank range. Mercer wrote until his fingers went numb. Later, as dusk settled and the prisoners were marched away, Mercer sat on an ammo crate near a burn barrel, flipping through his notes. The captain crouched beside him, silent for a long moment. "You hear that?" the captain said finally. "Hear what, sir?" That sound they all described. Same words, different men, different units, same fear. Mercer nodded. "They weren't exaggerating." "No," the captain said. "They weren't." A truck rumbled past on the road, canvas snapping in the wind. Somewhere to the east, artillery thudded, distant but steady. The war was still grinding on, mile by mile. Mercer thought about American tank crews, boys from Iowa and Pennsylvania, facing Panthers and Tigers now. He thought about what would happen if they ever met something like the tanks those Germans described. That night, as he lay on his cot in a drafty barn, Mercer couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined fog rolling in over a frozen field. He imagined a sound beneath the sound of the world, a heavy, unstoppable rhythm. And he imagined what a man says, what he feels, the first time he realizes the enemy has built something he cannot kill. The orders came down 2 days later, folded into the routine like they always were, quietly, without ceremony. Sergeant Mercer was to be attached temporarily to an intelligence detachment moving east with a mechanized column. The brass wanted comparisons, German accounts from Russia matched against what American units were seeing now, patterns, warnings. Anything that might save time, steel, or lives. The road. East was a ribbon of churned mud and broken stone. Burned-out vehicles lined the ditches like gravestones, some American, some German, some so blackened you couldn't tell anymore. Mercer rode in the back of a half-track with 3 others, Lieutenant Harris from Intelligence, a radio operator named Klein, and a medic everyone called Doc Feldman. They didn't talk much. The engine noise filled the space where words might have gone. At a crossroads near a village reduced to teeth and rubble, they stopped. A Sherman sat off to the side, its turret blown open like a peeled can. The smell hit first, burned, oil, scorched metal, something sweeter underneath. Feldman looked away. Harris climbed down and spoke to a tank commander standing nearby. The man's face was streaked with grime, his eyes red-rimmed. "Panther," the commander said. "Came out of the tree line. We never saw it until it fired." Mercer listened, thinking of the German corporal's voice. "We heard them before we saw them." As they pushed farther, the fighting thickened. The Germans weren't retreating cleanly anymore. They were delaying, snapping back, trading ground for time. Villages changed hands twice in a day. Fields that looked empty exploded with machine gun fire. One afternoon, the column halted abruptly. Orders crackled over the radio. Enemy armor reported ahead. Mercer felt it before he heard it. A vibration through the soles of his boots as he stood in the half-track, scanning the horizon. Then came the sound. Not loud at first, just heavy, like a door closing somewhere deep underground. Klein looked at him. "You hear that?" Mercer nodded slowly. From behind a low rise, tanks emerged, but they weren't Panthers. They were smaller, squatter, their armor sloped at sharp angles that caught the weak sun and threw it away. Olive green, mud-streaked, red stars barely visible beneath grime. Soviet T-34s. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the war itself had paused to watch. "They're ours," someone said, almost disbelieving. The tanks rolled past, engines growling, crews bundled against the cold. One of the commanders looked down at the Americans and raised a gloved hand, not smiling, not unfriendly. Just acknowledgement, men still alive. Mercer felt something tighten in his chest. These were the machines from the Germans' nightmares. Real, scarred, alive. Later, at a makeshift command post in a shattered schoolhouse, Mercer listened as American tank officers questioned Soviet liaisons through interpreters. The Russians were blunt. They spoke of losses like weather. They talked about the T-34 the way a farmer talks about a plow, practical, necessary, replaceable. "First time?" Mercer asked one of the interpreters quietly, nodding toward the Americans' stunned faces. The interpreter gave a thin smile. "First time seeing them up close," he said. "Not first time hearing stories." That night, Mercer sat with Feldman on the schoolhouse steps sharing a cigarette. "You think we're ready?" Feldman asked. "For what?" "For whatever comes next," Feldman said. "Feels like the war keeps finding new ways to surprise us." Mercer exhaled smoke. Those Germans, the ones I talked to, they weren't cowards. They were professionals. And those tanks broke them. Feldman was quiet. Somewhere nearby, a woman cried softly in the dark, an Allied civilian maybe, or someone who hadn't decided what side survival put her on yet. The next morning, the Germans counterattacked. It started with artillery, short, vicious barrages that chewed the ground into paste, then infantry, then armor. Panthers this time, sleek and deadly, moving with confidence. Shermans burned, men ran. Orders overlapped and collided. Mercer found himself pressed into service, relaying messages, dragging a wounded radio operator out of a ditch. He saw fear up close. American fear. Familiar, honest, controlled until it wasn't. In the chaos, a single T-34 broke through the smoke, its guns swinging. It fired once. Panther shuddered, smoke pouring from its rear. Fired again. Another German tank lurched to a stop. The Germans fell back, not in panic, but with a sharpness Mercer recognized from the prisoners' stories. Respect mixed with dread. When it was over, the field was quiet except for crackling fires and the low moans of the wounded. Mercer sat on the ground, hands shaking now that there was time for it. He realized then what those German soldiers had meant, not that the T-34 was invincible, but that it had changed something inside them, inside anyone who saw it come at them, relentless, unconcerned with fear. As stretcher bearers moved past, Mercer looked east again. The fog was lifting, but the sound, that deep, unstoppable rhythm, felt closer than ever. The snow started falling just before dawn, thick and wet, clinging to everything it touched. It muffled the world, turning the front into something unreal, quiet, colourless, deceptive. Sergeant Mercer stood in a shallow trench outside a nameless village, rifle across his knees, listening to the soft hiss of snow against his helmet. Somewhere ahead, engines idled, not loud, not yet. The attack had been expected. Intelligence always said that afterward. We knew they'd come. But knowing didn't make the waiting any easier. Lieutenant Harris crouched beside Mercer, map spread between them, the paper already soggy. "If they punch through here," he said, tapping a finger against the ink, "they'll cut the road. We lose armor support. We lose evac." Mercer nodded. He didn't trust his voice. Around them, American infantry hunched low, faces pinched with cold and tension. A Sherman crew smoked beside their tank, laughing too loudly, too fast. Feldman moved along the line, checking tourniquets that weren't needed yet. Then the ground spoke. A low rumble rolled through the earth, deeper than artillery, steadier than trucks. It crept up through Mercer's boots, into his legs, his chest. He didn't need to ask what it was. "Armor," someone whispered. The first shells landed short, geysers of snow and dirt erupting in white plumes. The second wave walked closer. Men flattened themselves instinctively. Orders were shouted, lost, shouted again. Out of the haze came German infantry, grey shapes moving fast. Machine guns opened up, stitching the snow. Mercer fired until his rifle clicked empty, hands numb, mind narrow and sharp. And then, through the smoke, through the chaos, came the tanks. Panthers this time, advancing with brutal confidence. One Sherman fired, missed. The return shot tore through it, flame blooming instantly. Mercer felt the heat on his face. "Fall back!" someone screamed. They did, yard by yard, clumsy and desperate. A Panther crested the rise, gun lowering, deliberate. Mercer thought of the German corporal's words, like stepping on an insect. The Panther fired. The world exploded sideways. Mercer hit the ground hard, ears ringing, snow filling his mouth. When he pushed himself up, the trench was gone. Men were gone. Just smoke and fire and pieces of things that had been men moments before. He crawled, vision swimming, until a hand grabbed his collar and dragged him behind the wreck of a stone wall. Feldman, blood on his face that wasn't his own. "You hit?" Feldman shouted. Mercer shook his head. He wasn't sure it was true. The Panther advanced again, unstoppable, its engine a living thing. American fire bounced, sparked, failed. Then a new sound cut through everything, heavier, faster, angrier. The snow to the left erupted as a T-34 burst through a hedgerow, tracks chewing earth and wood alike. Another followed, then another. They didn't slow, they didn't hesitate. The first T-34 fired on the move. The Panther shuddered, smoke pouring from its engine deck. The second shot finished it. The German tank burned, black smoke clawing at the sky. The battlefield changed in seconds. German infantry scattered, some firing, some running. Another Panther tried to pivot, too slow. A T-34 rammed it. Metal screaming against metal, then fired point blank. Mercer watched, frozen, as the fight turned savage and close. This wasn't the careful duel of distant guns. This was violence at arm's length. Machines colliding, men shouting inside steel coffins. One T-34 took a hit, its track blown apart. It spun, helpless. German fire poured in. The hatch popped open, and a Soviet crewman climbed out, on fire. He ran 3 steps and fell. Mercer felt something tear loose inside him. Feldman moved without thinking, dragging the man behind cover. The flames were already dying, leaving scorched cloth and skin. The crewman's eyes found Mercer's, wide with shock, then dimmed. The battle ended as suddenly as it had begun. German survivors pulled back, leaving their dead and burning machines behind. Snow settled again, hissing softly as it melted on hot steel. Mercer sat in the wreckage, chest heaving, hands shaking uncontrollably now. Around him, men laughed and cried and swore, the release ugly and necessary. He looked at the T-34s, scarred, smoking, alive, and finally understood the Germans. Not the fear alone, the helpless awe, the moment when a man realizes the world has tilted and there's no going back. This wasn't about sides, it was about survival, about facing something that rewrote the rules while you were still trying to follow the old ones. As stretchers moved and engines idled, Mercer stared east, where the snow kept falling, and wondered how many first encounters like this the war still had left to give. The snow kept falling long after the guns went quiet, burying the wreckage in a clean white lie. By morning, the battlefield looked almost peaceful, burned-out tanks softened by drifts, dark stains fading beneath fresh powder. The war had learned by then how to hide itself. Sergeant Mercer walked the line at first light, boots crunching softly, breath steadying as the shock drained out of him. He passed men wrapped in blankets, eyes hollow but alive. Feldman sat on an overturned ammo crate, hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette for the 3rd time. "Here," Mercer said, striking a match. Feldman leaned in, the flame briefly illuminating the deep lines in his face. "I keep thinking about that Russian kid," Feldman said quietly. "Didn't even look old enough to shave." Mercer nodded. "None of us do anymore. They didn't bury the dead right away. The ground was too hard. Bodies were tagged, covered, lined up along a stone wall that had once marked a farmer's field. American, German, Soviet. Death hadn't bothered to separate them." Later that day, Mercer was called back to the command post. The same intelligence captain was there, coat dusted with snow, eyes tired. "You saw it yourself," the captain said, not looking up from his notes. "Yes, sir. What the German said, does it track?" Mercer thought of the sound, the weight, the moment when fear shifted into something deeper and colder. "Yes," he said. "It tracks." The captain closed his notebook. "Then write it that way, not as a miracle, not as a monster, as a fact, something that changes men." Mercer understood. He went back to his cot that night and wrote by lantern light, fingers stiff, mind clear in a way it hadn't been for months. He wrote what the Germans had said, what the Americans had felt, what the T-34 did, not just to armor, but to certainty. A week later, the front moved on, villages fell, roads opened, the war kept grinding east, leaving behind names no one would remember. Mercer's detachment was dissolved, orders sending him back to his unit. On his last day, he stood by the road as a column of Soviet tanks rolled past again, heading toward whatever waited next. One of the tank commanders climbed halfway out of his hatch and caught Mercer's eye. He didn't smile, he just nodded once. Mercer returned the gesture. Years later, long after the war ended, long after parades and headlines and the slow forgetting, Mercer would sit on his porch back home and listen to tractors working distant fields. Sometimes, when the wind was right, the engines would hit a certain pitch, a certain rhythm, and for a moment he'd be back there, standing in the snow, feeling the ground move, understanding, finally, what those German soldiers had meant when they tried to put words to the moment the war changed for them. Not the day they lost, the day they realized they could.